So thank you for coming. I know everyone's got busy lives and stuff, so I appreciate people being interested. So if you were here last time, the end of June, we kicked off what we're going to call Government on Tap. And I'm glad that a lot of you have kind of, right, are embracing the philosophy. But the idea was to run a series of lectures. So we did the Declaration of Independence. Tonight's original idea was to really focus on the legislative branch. But as I was putting this together, I realized it's a great story just on how the Constitution came about and what it's about. We'll do a legislative branch one later. I think I've got a plan for the executive branch. We'll do the judicial. And then if people are still interested, maybe we'll do one on the Bill of Rights and then finally on federalism. And so really kind of delve into it. So with that, let's get into the story of the Constitution. So of the people, by the people, for the people, that was not wasn't a statement made around when the Constitution was created. Anyone know who gets credit for that little quip? What's that? Yeah, it's Abraham Lincoln. Exactly. Well done. But we're going to start, as again, on Government on Tap with some words of wisdom. We did quote Lincoln last time. We're going to quote FDR, our New Deal and World War II president, and his words of wisdom was that. All right? And he said that in the depths of the Great Depression as they repealed prohibition. So, pretty wise words. All right, so let's get into it. So I thought, rather than just me speak, I remember this speech when I was a kid, and it really did strike me and make me think about government. Ronald Reagan, love him or hate him when he was in presidency, I think his image has been burnished over with the passage of time. And he said this about the Constitution.
Ours was the first revolution in the history of mankind that truly reversed the course of government, and with three little words: we the people. We the people tell the government what to do. It doesn't tell us. We the people are the driver. The government is the car, and we decide where it should go and by what route and how fast. Almost all the world's constitutions are documents in which governments tell the people what their privileges are. Our Constitution is a document in which we, the people, tell the government what it is allowed to do. We, the people, are free.
And that really struck me. I remember I think I was 18 or something like that, how different that is. And growing up and looking at it, he's right. Almost every constitution is written by government. It's a set of rules. It says, hey, you guys can do this, you can do that. Ours is reversed. And that's what's the magic and the beauty of our system. It's the people tell the government what they can and can't do, at least in theory, okay? And we'll get into that. All right. Okay, so I hope you guys all have little cell phones, okay? So we're going to do a couple of interactive quizzes. But what I'd like to do, so I'm going to ask you what you know about the Constitutional Convention. Little true, false, or multiple choice, okay? So if you'd like, all you need to do is click that QR code on your phone, and it'll take you right in to the quiz. All right, the delegates, so it looks like everyone thought the true is that everyone went there to craft a brand new way to govern the United States. Makes sense, right? They call the convention, that's what they were there to do. That is false. That is false. They were not called to draft a brand new document, as we will see. The thing that is true is that the delegates kept all their deliberations completely secret. Boo, 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 gold star right here. Well done, okay? Thomas Jefferson was not at the Constitutional Convention. He was our delegate to France at the time. And then all states sent representatives to the convention. Bingo, Owen. Rhode Island did not send a delegation. So it was only 12 of the 13 states that sent them there. So well done. Okay, so let's get in. Let's look at this more. Yeah, you're done. All right, so let's start the story. We're going to start the story where we left off last time with the signing of the Declaration of Independence, okay? So July 4th, 1776, we are now an independent country. The Declaration of Independence, though, was not a document that showed how the government would work. All it was is what it says, a declaration, we are free and a nation. So now what they have to do, now what do we do now? They got to set up a government. So most people aren't aware, but when they passed the resolution authorizing Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and a few of those others to write the Declaration, at the same time they made another committee to actually go and craft a new document, a governing document. How will our new country be governed? And they worked on that, but they had to think through in the context of what they were going through, right? So the big thing that they rebelled against, it's all through the Declaration of Independence, was the fear of tyranny. They were rebelling against a tyrannical English government. And so they said, you guys create a document because tyranny's bad, we don't want it, make the new government weak. We don't want to go through that again. We're doing it right now, make a weak government. And they came up with the Articles of Confederation, okay? The Articles of Confederation get signed in 1777, about a year after the Declaration. And it is the system that we fought, for the most part, the War of Independence under. That was who managed it, okay? And they did indeed create a very weak central government. The power of the country resided in the sovereignty of the individual states. They called it like a confederation of friends. And the government was set up to do some things, but it was weak. And you get this idea, like, be careful what you wish for. They wanted a weak government, and they got one, okay? So when they said the power resides in the states, there was very, very little that the federal government could do, okay? In fact, there was no executive branch. There was no leader of the government. You had a single Congress where each state was individually represented. You had to have, almost everything had to be unanimously voted on to do anything. The states were sovereign. And each state was like, oh, I'm not going to give up my power. So they had effectively veto power over what the federal government could do. So no executive. And then the committees of the legislature would effectively carry out stuff. They couldn't tax. Remember that little thing about the tea tax and kicking those things into the harbor? They don't want, that's tyranny. Power to tax is the power to destroy. That is a quote from back there. And they didn't want the federal government to have that power, okay? They couldn't regulate trade. That was something that the states said, we're going to do. And each state, they were putting tariffs. New Jersey put tariffs on New York. They put tariffs on France. It's mayhem, absolute mayhem. And so they got what they kind of wanted. Now, during that time, there were two things really, though, that the Articles, they succeeded in really two main things. Anyone know what one was? This one's the obvious one. They did. They funded an army, right? The Continental Army. They asked, and they would go to the states and say, you guys you got to kick in some money. And then they would haggle with them, and maybe the states would send it, maybe they wouldn't. But that's how they had to get the money. They had to go beg the states to give it to them. So they did have an army. So what did they succeed in?
They had to have common currency, right?
They issued continentals, but the states could also issue money. Why are we not have a British flag flying over us? What'd they succeed at? They won. They ran the country during the Revolution, and they succeeded. We won the War of Independence. And it was the Articles of Confederation government that negotiated the Treaty of Paris in 1783 that started our government, or really ended the war. So that's awesome. So they did do some things. Everyone said, they never did anything. Not true. They did. Another thing that they did was, everyone hear of the Northwest Ordinance? This was when the colonies became independent. The state of Virginia claimed land all the way out to St. Louis. So did Pennsylvania, so did Georgia. All that territory that they got after 1783, all these states said, it's mine. The Articles, the Congress under the Articles passed the Northwest Ordinance, which rationalized the territory system, created territory of Kentucky and Tennessee and Ohio. The states gave up those claims, and they set up a system on how to set up territories. And you go to Ohio now, it's all checkerboard, and there's, it's got all the county systems. That was the Northwest Ordinance. And every state looks like that. They all look like that. So they did do some stuff, okay? But there was a lot of stuff they couldn't do, particularly around the economy. With this inability, people said, around money. There's different forms of money that are floating around, and therefore money is very scarce. Good money is scarce. People hoard it. And because of that, it became very, very difficult for people to pay debts off, because the value of the money was going up, which means the value of their debt was rising. And if you're a poor farmer, you've taken out loans to, buy your horse and oats and all that good stuff, and now you're having a really hard time repaying it. And then the big bankers in cities like Boston start to foreclose on your property. And this begins to happen. The economy's not doing well. Britain gives sticks his thumb up around this, the new country. They flood manufactured goods into the country, wrecks all our local things, and they do it because the United States is not paying, loyalist property values that they agreed to, and so the economy's in dire straits, and this leads something called Shays' Rebellion. Okay, so Shay, he was just a farmer in Western Massachusetts. They called it after him, but he was just some person like us, stand up in a room and said, this stinks. And they were upset. They took their anger out on local courthouses that held the deeds that to their farmland that were encumbered by these loans. And they broke into these courthouses, ripped them all up, burned them up, and they were going wild all through Western Massachusetts. Massachusetts couldn't call out the militia, because guess who were in the militia? The farmers. These guys are all Revolutionary War veterans. They have nobody. They say, help. Central government, we don't have any money either. They ask, no one gives it. And it's chaos. So think about this. If you have just fought and created a new country, and then you're seeing this go on, so there's this continuum between having freedom and order, right? There's some give and take between those two. And this kind of freedom to a lot of people starts to look like chaos. Like, we got a lot of freedom, no issues with tyranny from our central government, but this is a big result of that. And so people started to say, we need to maybe do something about it. Just as an aside, eventually, Massachusetts, their merchants got the hat out, went around to their merchants in Boston and raised money and hired mercenaries to go put this down. That's how they had to do it. But people were aghast at that. We have to do something about it. So they have some calls for change. So there's call for reform. And the first call for reform happens we've just signed the peace treaty in 1783. This is just 3 or 4 years later. And a bunch of states agree to meet in Annapolis, which is the capital of Maryland. But only 5 states actually send delegates. And the thought was, we've got to kind of fix this economy to get things going. And they all realize we need to fix more than that. But again, only 5 people show up. And when they talk about it with the other states, it's like, yeah, but there could be this tyranny thing. Like, let's let it work. And it's very difficult to get anyone to agree to do something. So finally, 2 people, James Madison, who we'll talk about more. He's from Virginia. He's a political science whiz kid. And Henry Knox. Henry Knox was the chief general of the artillery in the Revolutionary War. Fort Knox is named after him. Okay? They decide we have to do something too. And they go to petition the one most respected person in the new United States to say, we need your help to get some changes here. And George Washington says, you're right, we need to do it. They literally knock on his door in Mount Vernon and say, George, we got to talk to you. Will you support this convention? And that's the key to make it happen. George Washington says, we can't have this. We have to make some changes. And he commands such respect, the states all fall in line, except, as my son Owen said, Rhode Island. They're like, we're not doing that. And so they call this Constitutional Convention in 1787. So it's back in Philadelphia, same place they did the Declaration of Independence. It's called Constitution Hall or Independence Hall. I think it's called both. And it convenes in the summer of 1787. And they go there and they have to kind of, make the rules. So as soon as they get there, it was called not to create a new government. It was called to reform the Articles of Confederation. That's kind of the way they sold it. But James Madison had a plan in his back pocket. He knew we needed a new one. But they would never have gotten the convention done. They wouldn't have gotten enough states to go if they said that up front. So they closed the doors, and it's the first. That's what they start to talk about. But and James Madison, to talk about him, he is a planter from Virginia, rich family, slave owner. He was too young at first to be involved in the signing of the Declaration. He was 20, maybe something like that. But he is a political junkie. Hoovers up all the latest Enlightenment ideas, that kind of thing. He ends up getting elected to the Virginia House of Burgess, and then subsequently serves in the new Congress that runs the country. And he realized we need to do something, and he's got loads of ideas on how to fix it. So he's from Virginia. The other big player in the in the Constitutional Convention is Alexander Hamilton. All right. So Alexander Hamilton's an interesting character. He was born in Nevis Island in the Caribbean, sugar plantation. He left at a young age, came to New York, got educated. He ends up joining the Continental Army, and he's a whiz kid. Young, smart, whippersnapper. Washington sees him, and he makes him his chief of staff at a super young age. He's like Washington's right-hand man, runs the army for him. He realizes we need a strong government. These two go on to be very on either side of the political spectrum, but they get together in this one moment in time, and they agree we need a stronger central government. And their force of their personalities convinces the delegation, and with George's help in the back, he's not the one talking, it's them, that let's scrap the old thing. We're going to start from scratch. Yeah.
I'm trying to get the timeline straight here. So we have the Declaration of Independence.
Yep, so that's 1776. Then 1777, they adopt the Articles of Confederation.
And who wrote those?
It was a committee of the Second Continental Congress. They put that together, then it got ratified by all the states, and that became the governing document.
Okay.
Yeah, and then several years later were the calls to change it. So they come together, this moment in time, they team up with a common goal. Different perspectives, different backgrounds. Hamilton came from nothing. Poor kid. He came over almost as an orphan to the United States. And then they start what's called, we're beginning, all right, we've agreed we're going to frame a new government, okay? And the first rule of the convention, when they do that, it's like Fight Club. Don't talk about the convention, all right? That's the rule. So whatever we do, we're not talking about it. Any idea why they decided to do that? They were worried that if this got out, that people would riot and, start throwing rocks through the windows. They also worried that every word they said would be harped on in the press, and they wouldn't have been able to speak freely and debate and compromise. And so they made the decision, we're closing the windows. It's 90 degrees in Philadelphia. They don't have air conditioning. They're sweltering inside. And they all agree, when you go home, do not talk about it. And they didn't. Their deliberations never made it into the press. Madison kept copious notes of every meeting. He's the only guy, a convention member, who actually came to every meeting. Came to every one. Attendance from other delegates was pretty spotty, but he showed up. And he put a diary, but he said, do not publish this until after I'm dead. He didn't want this to come back on anybody. And so it was published in 1830-something when he died. Okay. So they don't talk about it. And again, it allows for free and open debate, and they were scared. They didn't want that pressure, and particularly like a mob who will say, you're turning back towards tyranny. Okay? So we're going to talk about what they kind of laid out. They agreed, like, our document should have several kind of ingrained principles that guide the construction of our country. All right? So this is how I remember the preamble when I have to talk to my students about it.
Hey, do you know about the USA? Do you know about the government? Can you tell me about the Constitution? Hey, learn about the USA. In 1787, I'm told our founding fathers did agree to write a list of principles for keeping people free. The USA was just starting out, a whole brand new country, and so our people spelled it out, the things that we should be. And they put those principles down on paper and called it the Constitution. And it's been helping us run our country ever since then. The first part of the Constitution is called the Preamble and tells what those founding fathers set out to do. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. In 1787, I'm told our founding fathers all sat down and wrote a list of principles principles that's known the world around. The USA was just starting out a whole brand new country. And so our people spelled it out. They wanted a land of liberty. And the preamble goes like this. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America, for the United States of America.
All right, so right there in the preamble, they tell you exactly, it goes back to what Reagan said about it. It's we the people in order to form a more perfect union. That, I always talk about that line. Like these are people. You know, a lot of people say, oh, our founding fathers, they're like, you know, these mythical characters. They're people. They have foibles. They're not perfect. They have lots of different things in their closets, just like everybody else does. But they go together and they get together to form what I would call a more perfect union. And I think those words are awesome because we're human beings. Will our union ever be perfect? No, because we're not perfect. But you can strive to get it towards perfection, and that's the goal you have to settle for, because we'll never get perfection because we're not perfect ourselves. But it lays out this idea of popular sovereignty, that it's the people who are giving the government their power. That's why the government has the power it does. It's laid out by them, okay? And I've got another little exercise for you guys here. You don't have to take it if you don't want. Yeah. So I've got an example of popular sovereignty. Again, having the people involved in their government. What's the best example? Choosing a House member. Pretty good guess. Pretty good guess. So choosing a president. Why is choosing a president not a great example of popular sovereignty?
The Electoral College does that, not us.
We don't directly vote for a president, and we'll talk about that later. But yeah, it's not a great example of popular sovereignty. Effectively, we choose someone who then choose for us. Supreme Court Justice, who chooses a Supreme Court Justice? The president. We don't get to choose that person themselves, okay? Choosing a senator, 0. I would argue that's the best example of popular sovereignty. And the reason I would argue this, and it's debatable, choosing a House member, there are, 12 districts in New Jersey? Is that right? 12 districts? Who gets to determine where the districts are? What's that? Yeah, the state legislature. You ever see how curly wiggly these districts are? They're set up that way to favor one party or the other. It's called gerrymandering. So these your assembly people don't really, if you're one party or the other, you may not have really a say in choosing your representative. You do, but it might be, the scales might be tipped one way or the other, okay? Senator, you can't jerry-rig a state. The state is the state. So everyone in the state votes for a senator. Doesn't matter if you live in New Jersey, you live in Newark, or you live up in Sparta. So I would argue that's the best example of popular sovereignty. Yeah. Aha, yes. Good question. When it was created, we'll talk about that, senators were not chosen by the people. There was an amendment to allow direct election of senators. So back in the day, if right when this was created, you're absolutely right. It would have been the House. Today, I would argue it's the Senate. Okay?
So the difference is popular sovereignty is
Yeah, it's this idea, that's exactly right. Popular sovereignty it's the majority, 51%, that's an expression of popular sovereignty. And that gets into the Constitution through this Enlightenment thinker, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He wrote, in like the 1740s, he wrote a book called The Social Contract. And this is where you get the idea of the greater good. Society should think whatever the majority wants, that's what they should get. And so that ideal is put in there. Makes sense, right? It's majority, democracy, what you want. So, and,
it's also in place to sort of circumvent the tyranny of the majority, because every state gets equal representation.
well, we'll talk about that too, because that is one of the issues you have to worry about, which is that idea of tyranny of the majority, which we'll speak about. So, principles of the Constitution. The next one is this idea of limited government. And that goes right back to this idea that they don't have all the power. They get the power that the people give them. And that's it. If they're not given it, they don't have it. Okay? So it's built into the Constitution that they have these different powers. One of these other talks, I'll talk about the specific ones. And this is where you get this idea of starting to limit the ability to do this. And I love this quote. Someone described democracy this way. Makes sense. And this is exactly this idea of this tyranny of the majority, right? Just vote on it. Hey, we all agree. Let's do it. And so you have to limit the ability of the government to kind of go hog wild and stuff. So it lists what the government is allowed to do, nothing else. Even if people all want it, no, can't do it. Not allowed. Not allowed. Okay. And this is this also idea in here, no one is above the law, okay? So we've had something to just come out on this over the summer. We don't have to do the quiz. It was just a yes, no. I was just wondering if people had an opinion on it. Is this true? No one is above the law? You guys saw the Supreme Court ruling.
Have that tested.
What's that?
An interesting test to see.
Well, it is being tested right now, right?
If you read the decision, we were talking about
Right, the presidential immunity.
right.
Mm-hmm.
It's only for legitimate acts as a president where he has undisputed immunity.
Right.
He's not above the law on any personal basis, no different than you or I. And I wouldn't want a president that is constrained as long as he's acting within reasonable powers, if you would, to protect the country.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of where the Supreme Court came down. The majority ruling was, look, the president is given powers by the people expressly to do certain things, okay? One is commander-in-chief of the military, for instance. And as long as the president is operating within those powers, then he can't, the Constitution, the people allow him to do it. So he's operating within the law, okay? Now the counter argument would be, well, he's commander-in-chief. Why can't he just order the army? This was one of the Supreme Court justices said this in their rebuttal. Go out and shoot the opposition candidate. You're the commander-in-chief. You get to do that. They tell you can do that. What's that?
It has to be the official business of the president.
But if the president claims that he's doing what's best for the country, then
Exactly. This is the gray area. Now,
Is this where you have the legislative branch that can actually check his balance?
well, how would they check his power?
Well, they would impeach the president.
Well, that's the ultimate thing. It hasn't been tested on some degree like that, but they did say, like, presidential immunity is the way the Justice Department has been operating since the Clinton years. They wrote up a document on it and said, yeah, we think this is within his powers. And this came up. Barack Obama, during when we were involved in Syria, he ordered a drone strike on an American citizen who had been recruited to ISIS. He was probably going to go and kill some American soldiers in there. Can the president just execute, no trial, no jury, no charges given, American citizen? It's a question, right? The Justice Department looked at it and said, well, he's operating in his constitutional duties, and they just let it lie. What's that? You know, it was, but Trump's Justice Department could have brought him up on that afterwards, and they chose not to. So these are tough questions. Our system, though, does have something built in when we'll get to that. Congress can impeach the president, and if the Senate convicts him, he can be tried on what he did in office, on those charges. So if he's charged with murder, for instance, in that case, and he's convicted in the Senate, he can be then charged for murder afterwards. But in theory, the way this ruling, right, I'm not a lawyer, it seems to me that unless that happens, he is immune, as long as, to your point, that it's defined as his powers. And again, you know, this is all, some of it's semantics, obviously a lot of it's law, but like the Constitution is the law.
It doesn't work like qualified immunity for the police, where they have immunity so long as you're not violating someone's rights or breaking the law.
Yeah.
If you lose their qualified immunity and be charged with a crime.
Exactly.
It doesn't work that way. I mean, if the president were to just have his political opponent assassinated without a trial, that seems to be clear violation. It doesn't seem to fall under the subjectivity of some of these other examples that you're talking about, like a treasonous U.S. citizen abroad.
Right, but say he just said, well, he was going to, you know, become a dictator, or he's a threat to democracy, right, and we have to get rid of him, and I'm saving the country. So is he? Whatever, but it becomes an issue where our system would say, at least given that, if a court would say that he's right, he was, in his mind, he was operating one of his duties is to protect the citizenry, then Congress would have to get involved.
So even though the judicial branch may not be able to do something, the legislative branch can still do something.
The judicial branch can't do anything. It's the legislative branch that would have to try him. So it's an interesting question, and this is like why the Constitution is interesting. It's still this document that, you know, people have very strong opinions around, and it's not settled. Like, things come up all the time about this stuff on what it is, and this is just the latest thing. Yeah.
I think one of the most important arguments that was raised at the Supreme Court is that what if there is no limited immunity, and that what that would do to constrain the chief executive and anyone in the executive branch, they could be sued in any jurisdiction for basically anybody's idea of what is not within their purview.
Yeah, great point. And this summer, when this ruling came out, all these congressmen were going, above the law, blah, blah, blah. You know who has immunity for their official acts? Congressmen. Congressmen do. And that's settled law. Same idea. They're working, they can't be sued or brought to court or charged for things that they do following the powers that the people through the Constitution give them. And that's settled law. You know, you don't hear congressmen saying that we're above the law. So again, you know, it depends where you come down on the debate. But congressmen, that's been settled law. I don't know when that court case came out, but it's a long time ago. What's that?
In certain cases, they have different laws too. For a while, it was not illegal for them to trade on insider information.
Yeah, that's true. Still a gray area. There you go. It's a good gig. Yeah.
Write bad checks.
Yeah. Right. All right. So let's keep going. So limited government, second principle. All right. I'm going to introduce another Enlightenment figure very briefly. This is a guy, Montesquieu, the Count de Montesquieu. He writes a book called The Spirit of the Law in 1748. And his view is that people, again, not perfect, power corrupts. Once you get it, you want it. It's hard to get it away, and you want more. And the longer you're in office, the worse it'll be. And he cites all these things. And he talks about human nature and all that kind of stuff. And he says, so any government that's got to get set up, what did I just do here? Has to get set up. A way to avoid that is you have to separate power in a government. And this was a very criticism, at least in theory, of like a monarchy. Like the king, in a lot of these countries, is the chief executive. They also make the laws, and they judge people. They're the ultimate arbiter of justice in their system. All those branches, they do all of them. And his view is, how can you not get corrupt? Every human being would get corrupt if they had that much power. So we need a system that separates power diffuses power. And the Constitution embeds that. That's why we have a separate legislative branch. We have a separate executive and a separate judiciary. And there's even another split in power in our system, which is power between the federal government and the states. So there's all that. So power is diffused in our system, and that is a guard against tyranny by diffusing it. In addition, it says you got to go even further. These groups have to be able to check each other's power. And this is a little different from separation of powers, because what Montesquieu says is because people are greedy for power, we know the executive branch is going to be like, more power, more power, more power. But at the same time, the legislative branch is going to be doing the same thing. And so they'll be like competing with each other. And that competition will keep the other branch's powers in check. Does that make sense? So that you have to set up a system where they can check each other's ability to do whatever they want. And that's embedded in our system too, through like presidential veto or what we talked about, impeachment, things like that. There's another check. The legislative branch was considered to be the most dangerous branch that could go off the rails. So they even separated that power. Think about it. There's two houses. They don't even allow all the power to reside in one house. And they have a check on each other because the House can bring up anything having to do with new taxes, but the Senate doesn't have to approve it. Right? So they have all these systems built in. So those are two other principles of the Constitution. And they work well because they don't ignore human nature. There's a very famous quote by Madison. He said, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government. He's right? But we're not. We're not perfect. So checks and balances uses people's nature in order to keep anyone from getting too much power. All right, another couple more. Judicial review is this idea, again, this is a check. It's an independent judiciary that sits on its own. And this is built into the Constitution. The only court that is created in the Constitution is the Supreme Court. And they don't even tell you what it is. They said there is a Supreme Court that is the highest court in the land. And then they say Congress shall figure out the rest of the federal court system, including the composition of the Supreme Court. That's why these things come up every now and then about court packing or putting limits on people. But the judicial system was recognized as the weakest branch of government. Alexander Hamilton wrote about it and said, the judicial branch has neither the power of the purse or the sword, and therefore it's weak. And we have to bolster it by giving them this lifetime appointments, so they're immune from public pressure. They can't be defunded by Congress. They can't be threatened by the president. Like the executive has the power of the sword, and Congress has the power of the purse. They have nothing. All they can do is give their opinion. And sometimes presidents have taken advantage of that. Andrew Jackson very famously said that around when they were kicking the Cherokee off their land. He said, well, you go enforce it. I'm not going to. And nobody did. And so the Cherokee got kicked off their land. It was deemed to be unconstitutional. So judicial review is embedded, this idea that the courts have the power to check both branches. And the last one is this idea of federalism. Okay? The U.S., the states are still sovereign. They share power. Okay? They have their own things that they do. The federal government has things that they can do. The Constitution, though, is set up as the supreme law of the land, and the way it's written, there are some things that they say the states cannot do. So the states have to accept some limits on what they can do as well. And this is our system. And I have up there some shared powers. Some, both entities can borrow money, establish courts, for instance. States deal with education. Usually public safety, marriage laws, that kind of thing. But the federal government is the only one who can declare war, make money, foreign policy, all that type of stuff. Okay? So it's shared. Okay? Now, this is a contentious few months. This is 4 months that they're working to get this thing done. And they're from all over the country. They all come in with different ideas around how things are going to work. And they have to compromise. Okay? It can be a very dirty word. But it's a settlement of a dispute that is reached by each side making concessions, meaning they don't get everything they want. And I found this little quote from Barack Obama in 2011 about that. You don't get 100% what you want. And people who stand to do that, a lot of times you're not going to get anything done because it's the nature of going back and forth. And the Constitution has a bunch of compromises built into it that didn't start out that way, and the delegates, the 54 people, hashed it out. Okay? So representation is a big one. All right? And I've got this up here. You have the states represented down in Philadelphia. And not all states are the same. All right? So there were a couple of very big states. Virginia, huge population. Pennsylvania had a big population. New York. Then you had all these smaller states, right? And so it's like, well, how do you represent the people? How do you do that? And if you're a small state, you might think very differently than if you're a large state around that, because large states have a ton of people. It's democracy, right? We should have a bigger say. Small states are, but we don't want to get beat up, bullied by the big states. So maybe you shouldn't have a big say. And this is a big battle. And so right away they have to figure out this idea of representation. What does that mean? Okay? And the first one was Madison. As I said, he was ready. He had a plan, and he lays it right on the table. It's called the Virginia Plan. And this is where you're going to have a 3-branch government. Yep, he read his Montesquieu. He knows we're going to separate powers around. But he said, look, it's democracy. Larger states, it'll be proportional representation based on population. So Virginia will have more representatives in the Congress and the Senate than New Jersey will. Makes sense, right? And he splits it up, lower house elected directly by the people, to get around this idea, go back to this tyranny of the majority to slow things down, scared about mob rule. The upper house is going to be nominated by state legislatures. All right. So, but again, it's all based on population. So that's his plan. New Jersey's like, no, not so fast. Why would we do that? We have a system in place now, i.e. the Articles of Confederation, where we have one vote. We have the same vote as Virginia. Why would we ever give that up and join a new government? That's insanity if you're from New Jersey's perspective. Can't do it. They'll lynch me back in Trenton. So they come up with a plan, this guy Patterson, 1-chamber legislation where each state allows one vote. Effectively, they weren't very creative. They just took the article government and said, let's just use this for our government, okay? And then they have to start getting into the back room and compromising. And they come up with this idea of a great compromise. So it's someone from Connecticut actually comes up with it. This guy Sherman, I think his name is. And he says, look, let's pick some little bit of both. And that's what they do. So they say, we'll have the two houses. We like the idea of separation of powers, just like Madison said, but in the Congress, we'll have the lower house, which will be based on population. So that's the lower house. The larger house, though, New Jersey, you'll get what you want too. That will be equal representation. But instead of having one vote, you get two votes. Okay? And that is something that New Jersey fought hard for, and we'll see why. It's better to get two votes than one vote, okay? Because it gives you more power, as we'll see later on in other things, okay? And that's what they came up with. So each side got something. It was a compromise. Neither side was completely happy, but they get what they want. So it balances the needs of the small states with the large states, okay? This was a trickier one, okay? Again, we don't have to do the thing if you don't want to, but there were 13 states in the new United States. Of those, I listed them there. How many you think were slave states? What's that? All of them? Anybody say, I have that as one of my choices? All of them? 1, 2? 12 out of 13? How about, let's do this, more than 10. More than 10. All right. How about none? None? 0. No votes for 0. Okay, good. You guys are paying attention. How about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4. How about 6? 6 states. Okay. What's that? 5 or 6? Okay, 5 or 6. The correct answer is 8 states. Look at those red states up there. New Jersey was a slave state. So was New York when the Constitution was created. But that's the split. Now, New Jersey and New York didn't have a lot of enslaved people, but they had some, and it was legal. It was legal, okay? The South had a big thing around this because 40% of the people living what I would consider the South, it wasn't called that then, but the Mason-Dixon line was drawn in the early 1800s. Below Maryland and Delaware on down, 40% of the people there were enslaved, okay? So there's this debate. Should they be represented or not represented? And if you do, how do you count them? What do you do? The South's like, well, they're people. You guys always talk about it. They should be represented. And then the North's like, really? Come on. You treat them like they're property. They're not, that's your definition. So they should not be counted at all. And this becomes a big debate. Because again, the South, you need the South to vote in the new Constitution. If they all get up and walk, you've got nothing. You don't have a country. And this becomes the big debate. Now, just to be curious, New York became a free state in 1799. Okay? New Jersey, 1807. And that, they actually still allowed indentured servitude, which some people, depends on your opinion, some people claim that's still a form of slavery. And I read somewhere when I was doing this, you know, we talk about Juneteenth, the last enslaved person was freed down in Texas. I read somewhere, someone claims there were still 6 enslaved people living in New Jersey 4 or 5 months after Juneteenth. I've only read that once. I haven't seen that corroborated, but they talk about it in this idea of this indentured servitude system that Jersey still had. Okay? But technically became a free state in 1807. So what was the compromise?
The three-fifths compromise?
Yeah, so the South wanted enslaved people fully counted for representation. That's their argument. Obviously, the North did not. And this is a political battle, but it's also a moral battle, right? Like, what's right? There's power involved in this, there's money involved in this, and there's right and wrong involved in this, okay? And they went back. They couldn't come up with an agreement. They went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Then finally said, up for consideration when this was going on was a deal that got hammered out to amend the Articles of Confederation. It was going to have to get voted on unanimously to pass. But they said, look, we need to get money. And one of the amendments that they came up with was we need to be able to tax the states. Makes sense, right? They couldn't tax. So they made an agreement. And in it, they fought because they wanted to do the taxation would say, Virginia, you owe us $100 because you have 100 people there. Jersey, you owe us $50 because you only have 50 people. Then the argument became the North said, well, we got to count. You got to count all the enslaved people as people because they wanted to tax them. And the South said, no, they're property. We don't want to count them at all. They're not, we don't want to count them at all. And they agreed back and forth in the coming up with the amendment for the Articles. Let's settle on they are 3/5 of a person. 3/5 of a person. And so Madison said, all right, we got to sort this out. And he said, like, now you guys are arguing the exact opposite because now it's about representation. So he proposed, let's go back to the same compromise, 3/5. And people are like, okay, they voted on it, 8-2, done, like that. It went away. So they kind of kicked it down the road, all right? And this is a tough one, right? A tough one. And they were struggling with this idea again, like, do you have a country or you don't? And what's the idea of a more perfect union? Like, do we have the ability to change this in the future or not? And this is a tough one. And what they said, they decide with this is a quote from Madison, decides with great propriety on the case of our slaves when it views them in the mixed character. They say, well, they are people, but their bondage, he quotes this later, takes off 2/5 of them, their situation. This is a tough one, but that's what they came up with.
How significant was the abolition movement around the time of the framing?
Well, it was moving. Like I said, like New York, several years later, said we're going to vote around this. And slavery was allowed in most of the colonies early on, and over time, they got rid of it. Ben Franklin actually started an abolitionist movement in Pennsylvania. It was the oldest one in North America, and he set it up in like the 1750s.
Even at the time of the slave owner, Jefferson was sort of wanted to get rid of the institution as well, around the time of the framing.
Yeah, well, Madison was a slave owner too. He owned like 400 slaves. A lot of the representatives were slave owners. Now, there was this thought, they not only compromised on this 3/5, they compromised on the slave trade too, because a lot of people, when they looked at it, said it's abhorrent regardless, but a sign of how bad it is when you actually see human beings being sold. And these are these slave auction sites. And the South wanted to keep them going. The North said, we can't allow this. Like, all right, well, we'll hold our nose and go with this 3/5, but we got to get rid of this. And they settled on, we'll allow it for 20 years. So we'll allow the importation of enslaved people for 20 years. It goes away in 1808. And it did. It did. And after 1808, it was illegal to bring in enslaved people into the United States. I think some of the stuff that I've read, just like the North, it was going away. There was a view that, all right, we'll do this, but it's going to go away anyways. It's just not economically viable. People are going to come up around it, and it'll go away on its own. So maybe that was wishful thinking. I mean, obviously it was in hindsight, But there also was a change that took place around the economics of slavery on the plantation system, which was the cotton gin. Eli Whitney invents this thing. All of a sudden, owning enslaved people sadly becomes profitable, very profitable. And that keeps the South's economy gets addicted to that. And before that, though, they thought, oh, it's probably going to go away at some stage. At least that was the hope. And obviously it never did until the Civil War. But that's a big compromise. And you know, whatever way you want to come down on it, this is something that's certainly one of the things that people debate. Should they have done it? Should they not have? It certainly, it took 80 years for this to go away. Okay? Electing the president is a compromise too. How do you elect him? All right? And again, we vote on him. All my students think, yeah, we vote for the president. I'm like, no, you don't. You don't. But again, it's a compromise, and this goes back to the power of the states. This little thing here, you know, that would be the proportional power of the states to elect a president if it was proportional thing. And the thought around it is, yeah, you would never see Donald Trump or Joe Biden in New Jersey. They would all, or I'm sorry, Kamala or Biden. They would spend all their time in those 4 states, and that's what you'd get. But so they had to figure this out, and it's a complicated question because there's no roadmap. Never been done before. There had never been in history a chief executive that you had to elect. So they were flying blind. They had to figure it out. So what do? So there's all these pros and cons around what they're going to do. One proposal was, let's just let Congress elect the president. They're representatives of the people. They can elect them. And they shot that down pretty quickly because you don't want your executive to be beholden to Congress. It's just going to lead to corruption. It's deal making, and you get me elected, I'll do this for your states and all that kind of junk. So they reject that. Then the other side is they bring up the idea of popular vote. And if you've noticed, a lot of the things around the Constitution, they are very wary of this idea of the tyranny of the majority or mob rule or whatever. And they object to this because one thing they say, well, you know, the average person doesn't really know enough. This is kind of classism, snobbery. You know, you can't trust the uneducated farmer to really know what's good for themselves. Okay, so there's definitely that going on in this. But there's also that you don't want to have pressure from what they would call a democratic mob. The mob who really wants this demagogue to be president, and they get to elect him. 51%, they all want, you know, something to happen, and that guy gets in. So they wanted to make sure that that couldn't happen either, okay? And they thought like a populist president, because he could appeal directly to his voter base, the people who get him in, could just bypass Congress, could call out his 51% and intimidate and run rampant on the system. So all these reasons, they finally reject it, and they go with the Electoral College, okay? So the Electoral College is set up where the states get electors, and this is where the small states get a big advantage, because each state electors is determined by the number of people they have in the Congress. So it's the number of House representatives, which is based on your population, plus your 2 senators. So think about this. Like if you live in a state like North Dakota, you have one, say that's representative of one person, okay? They, though, get their 2 senators thrown on. So that one person's vote is magnified 3 times when they're voting for president. If you live in California, there's 54 people living there. It's like they have 56 people living there when they're voting for the president. They only get like an extra bump of 1 in about 2%. So it's 300% for the person from North Dakota, 2% bump for California. It really does add up where the small states get a disproportionate amount of say in electing the president. Now, you could say that's fair, unfair, whatever, but again, this is the compromise. And when they had to make it, the small states, remember, the small states come into the Constitutional Convention with a lot of leverage because that's the government they have. They're asking them to give up power because they have the same vote as Virginia. And so they're like, well, if we're going to elect the president, we just don't want the president to be the president of Virginia. We want a say in the presidential election too. And this was the compromise that they came up with, okay? Now, when they did this originally, they thought, oh, you know, you're going to get these electors, and then the electors will get together, and they'll vote for whoever they want. They'll just pick who they think the right person is. Remember, political parties haven't formed yet in the United States. There was no thought that there would be Republicans and Democrats, or Federalists and Whigs, whatever you called them back then. So they didn't think that electors would be sorted. They just picked the people they thought were the best. States now can make rules on this. And the other thought was that the 14 delegates from New Jersey, they can all vote any way they want. And they should. So you'd vote for an elector in this area, and that person would go off and they would vote whoever they thought best, but not all 14 would vote the same way. The states over time, a power that the states have is they get to determine how elections are run. And they've made these changes where most states now require that whoever wins the majority in the state, all the electors have to vote that way. And so they go by blocks. And with party politics, this also keeps third parties from having any traction because it's an all or none system like that. And an interesting fact, the most amendments from the time it was done to today, the proposals have been to reform the Electoral College. None of them have succeeded. None of them have. And there's a reason for that. Because you need 3/4 of the states to agree to it. There are a lot of small states who are never going to agree to that. They're never going to do it because they're going to give up their ability to elect a president. All right, so the Constitution they finally created. There's 7 articles in it. These are sections, and you get the legislative branch, executive, judicial. Article 4 the first 3 lay out the structure and the powers that each branch has. And you know, it will. The idea was to talk about each of those separately at some stage. Article 4 is federalism, how that works. Amending the Constitution, whole thing in there about how do you change it. Easy or hard to change the Constitution? It's really hard. You know how many times it's been done? 27. They did 10 right away. And the last one was done in the 80s. That had been on the table for almost 200 years. They'd been well, they weren't talking a lot about it, but it was a college kid, or no, a doctoral thesis, said, this is a good idea. We should do this. And people looked at it, he wrote a paper on it, and they said, yeah, it is a good idea. Trivia fact, the original the Bill of Rights, it has 10 amendments. It was originally proposed with 12, one of which is now the 27th Amendment that they voted on. I was waiting for someone to ask me that question. The 27th Amendment, do you know?
The Congress can't vote for their own pay raise.
They can, right.
They can vote for it, but it doesn't go into effect until the next.
Exactly. They can't vote themselves a pay raise, but they can vote for the next Congress to get a pay raise. And when the kid wrote that, said, why don't we have this? It seems like a good idea. And everyone said, it is. So you have to face the voters after you've given a raise to your institution.
You got a D on the paper, by the way.
Did he? Wow. Teachers aren't perfect. Yeah, there you go. And then, like I said, Article 6 deals with oaths and the supremacy clause. This is where it tells you that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. There is no other law that supersedes it. Supersedes everything. And then how do you ratify it, okay? Anyone know? How many states? Now think about this. So there's 13. The Articles of Confederation, they had to be adopted unanimously to change it. What they came up with? What's that?
9 states.
Yeah, it's 3/4. 3/4. Think about how radical that is. That's a revolution, right? They literally changed the rules at this convention. You only need 9. Now, Rhode Island's not there, so they can't really object too much. But that's pretty radical. You don't have to have everybody in the room agree. But once we get 9, we're throwing out the Articles of Confederation. That's a revolution right there. Radical move that they do. And everyone's like, you're right, let's do it. And it still takes 3/4 of the states to ratify a change to the Constitution. Okay.
Well, there's talk of a constitutional convention, right?
Yes. So they made it basically. There's two ways to propose amendments to the Constitution. One is that 2/3 of Congress, both the House and the Senate, have to agree to a proposal. Then it becomes a proposed amendment. The other way is that if 2/3 of the states agree that we should have a constitutional convention, the Congress has to call one. And then the states send delegates. They get to decide how they're going to do that. And they get in a room, and then they hash out what amendments they want to have. So there is a proposal right now to try and get a convention of states together. And I think they have 20-something that have signed on so far. They got to get to, I think, 35 to do it. And one of the there's debates on both sides whether they should do that or not. But one of the pro of that is a big thing that they would like to push is to put term limits on Congress. And the thought is this gets floated all the time, and there's a snowball's chance in hell that they're ever going to vote term limits on themselves. So the states have to do this. So that's one of the rationales. But the negative that I've read is that if everyone shows up there, you don't know what you're going to get. It could be a Pandora's box. Who knows what crazy changes people may want. But still, after that, whatever changes they propose, 3/4 of the states would have to agree to it. Either their state legislatures or a special convention of approvers could do it, where they actually have people all get together in a room and they vote on it. There's only been one amendment that's been approved that way. Usually it's all 26 have been approved by state legislatures. It usually takes either a couple of months up to several years. The Equal Rights Amendment died on the vine, never got done. One amendment was done by the states all sent approval committees. They all met in a room, and then they voted. It was done right away. Anyone know?
Is it repealing prohibition?
That's it. Yeah, that is a great idea. Get in there. Vote on it. We don't want to wait. So they did it that way. All right. So ratification. So now they've created a document. They open the shutters, they open the windows, and they tell the world, this is what we got. And now their fight really begins, okay, on how they do it. And it breaks down. I got this little video. It's about a minute long, so bear with me.
For 5 months during this year of 1787, from May to September, we have met in secret at Independence Hall, enduring the sweltering Philadelphia heat to create a new document altogether, the United States Constitution. And after much debate and compromise, our new government is ready to be unveiled to the American people for ratification by the 13 states. However, two groups have emerged with opposing views on this new government.
We are the Federalists, those of the Congress in favor of this new Constitution. We represent the urban city dwellers and are led by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. Our best and brightest minds have thought long and hard to combine the best elements from the best governments of the past to create a unique government the world has never seen. We have written 85 essays called the Federalist Papers to explain our Constitution and encourage ratification.
Not so fast. Not all are in favor of this Constitution. We are the anti-Federalists. Members of the Congress who are against the Constitution. We represent the farmers and are led by Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and Samuel Adams. The Constitution renders our federal government, or the central government, way too strong. The power should remain with us and the states. The limitation of government is the surest record of the happiness of the people.
All right, so they came down on both sides. Like Patrick Henry famously said he wouldn't go to the Constitutional Convention because, quote unquote, he smelled a rat. They're going to make this thing too powerful. And those are big names. Like Samuel Adams was probably the single biggest proponent of revolution in the colonies. He got it really going way before other people were even thinking about it. And he looked at it and goes, this thing, no way, no way. This is way too much power in one place. So there was a big argument about it. And this is kind of how it played out.
During this year of
So the Anti-Federalists, I call this thing et tu, Brutai. Anyone know what that refers to?
Julius Caesar.
Yeah, the Senate stabbing and killing Julius Caesar because he was about to become a dictator. Okay, so a bunch of people. This is a holdover of pre the Revolution, where people would write letters, usually against the British government, but they were all anonymous. They took on these little cute pen names, and they continued that in this debate over the Constitution. And these were written by people like Brutus, Cato, Cicero, these defenders of the Roman Republic against tyranny, i.e. Julius Caesar. Okay, and they argued that it's never going to work. And their main arguments were twofold. That they said, one is that the country's too big, and that people in charge will not really represent the people because they're too far away. They won't really know what they want. And you're going to have this little bubble in the Beltway who are going to do what they want and not really care about what's going on out in the country. That was sort of their fear. You can argue whether that's true or not, but that's their fear. Too big to govern that way. They also said they were adamant that one power you're giving Congress is a big problem, the power to tax. In and of itself, that's going to lead to disaster. We'll be overtaxed. That really will take away our freedom. The other things they said was that the Supreme Court, you give them a little power, they're going to take over. They'll wreck the state court system. You're saying the states will be? No, they won't. They will override anything having to do with the states. So they were really, really concerned. And they published a bunch of different articles around that. And their big thing that they said, what about rights? Nothing in this whole thing about rights. How can you pass something like that? We have rights. And they were worried because they said, yeah, Rhode Island, one of the reasons Rhode Island didn't send people was because Rhode Island was a colony that was founded on freedom of worship. They left Boston to set up that colony. So you can worship whoever you want there. And they had that in their constitution. And they're like, we're not giving that up. And that was one of the reasons why they boycotted the Constitutional Convention. And this was a powerful argument, that the states had, different state constitutions had bills of rights or individual rights protected. And they were worried that this Constitution, because it's the supreme law of the land, is going to supersede those rights. Now, the Federalists, they published letters under the name of Publius, so the people. And as that little thing goes, they wrote 85 letters. It was 3 guys, though. It's still not 100% sure who Brutus was, or Cato. People have an idea, but it's never been 100% proven. But they do know that Publius was Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. They wrote the letters. And they laid out an incredibly logical defense of the Constitution. I teach it in AP Government. These are these documents that lay out why separation of power and checks and balances will stop tyranny, why we are creating an executive, what is that for? How does the government stop the majority or the tyranny of the majority? Things like that, okay? These are considered by the Supreme Court today to be primary documents on how the framers were actually thinking at the time. So they quote them. They quote, oh yeah, Federalist 78. You know, this is what they were thinking. And it's a window into the convention that they still use today when they are deciding on constitutionality around laws. And finally, this debate goes back and forth, and they find the Federalists give in. That argument around rights, they don't have a great defense for. And they say, all right, you're right. We'll deal with that when we get the government set up. Okay? They don't say we're going to go back into the drawing board. There were some people who said, go back, redo it, come back again. They knew that was never going to get done because the cat's out of the bag. But they said, we will go look at it. And this started the ratification process. Okay? Delaware, you know what their license plate says? First in freedom, right? They were the first state to ratify the Constitution. It was a contentious thing. You have to get to 9. Massachusetts, I think, was 7th. And this became the one everyone's focused on. Sam Adams is fire and brimstone up there, yelling and screaming, we don't want this. John Hancock, signer of the Declaration of Independence, was also not a fan. And this debate went on and on. And they finally agreed. They won the day by only, I think it was like less than 12 votes. We're going to ratify, but amend. And with their ratification, they also sent down, we ratify it on the condition that the first thing they do is amend it. And this kind of became the idea that got them over the top. New York was the next big one. That got ratified, and it became the supreme law of the land. All right? So this guy, Ben Franklin, he was one of the longest serving political people in the colonies and into the United States. He was at the Albany Convention right after the French and Indian War, around what to do with the colonies. So that goes way back to 1763. It's a long, long career in politics. He was the oldest delegate to the convention. He could barely walk. They had to carry him in on a chair. They had local prisoners at the city jail. That was their job, their punishment. They had to carry Ben around on a chair. And they brought him in there. When they finally voted on this thing, he comes out, and this is his quote. He gets asked, well, doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy? And this is what he said to him. If we can keep it. Okay, so I think it's a pretty interesting venue. Like, you know, it works, but we all need to be involved in supporting it. And there are some interesting tidbits around the Constitution. It is the oldest governing document on planet Earth. Written down one. Now, whenever I tell this to my English friend, like, we've had a constitution before you, but it's not written down. It's all based on case law and precedent. There's no writing. So we do have the oldest one, despite my British friends say. So it's the oldest one. It's also the shortest. They were brief. Think about it. It's only about what they give them to do. They don't have to lay out 1,000 things that they allow the citizenry to do. It's only about what they can do. So it's the shortest governing document. They did it in 100 days. That's pretty wild. They hammered all this stuff out. Now, they were hot and sweaty and sweltering. Probably wanted to get out of there. This is something that surprises a lot of people. Not once. Not once. And you can see that, like I said, and I tell my students this, we do not live in a democracy. We live in a federal republic, and there's a difference. And the framers were very cognizant of that difference, and democracy doesn't appear there. This guy, Governor Morris, he was the chief writer, including the preamble. He doesn't get the press that Thomas Jefferson gets, but he was a pretty eloquent writer as well. And here's our friend Rhode Island. They finally were the last to ratify it, but it took them a long time. The government was up and running. A year after Washington gets sworn in, they finally decide to ratify the thing. Now, this is an interesting stuff. As I said, people were coming in and out all the time. New York, the delegates in New York, 2 of the 3, I think, said, we're done with this document. We don't like it. And they left. They went back to New York. So Hamilton stayed, and he was a mover and a shaker. He didn't have the quorum, though, to vote for the state of New York, because there weren't enough members there. So there wasn't a quorum. So George Washington said, yeah, it got ratified by 11 states in Hamilton. Yeah. And this is interesting. It was not unanimous. There were 3 delegates there who said, we got to keep working on this thing. Too much power to the central government. And they fought long and hard. Ben Franklin gave a very impassioned speech on the last day, saying, please, for the sake of our country, you've got to come on board. And the 3 people said, nope, we're not going to do it. So it was not a unanimous document.